Okay, for those of you guys who are watching Coach's Eye, we're on a podcast. And for those of you who listen to a podcast, we're on Coach's Eye. So what I'm trying to accomplish within my pitching mechanics, I want to preface by saying this is what I'm trying to do. This is stuff that I've done trial and error with over, I mean, you guys see my stuff. Like, you know that I'm a big advocate of kind of just throwing stuff up against the wall, seeing if it sticks. Now, I'm going to speak from what I believe makes sense to me and what I'm trying to accomplish. I'm going to speak from what my body type presents, and how that kind of varies per individual, obviously. And then I'm going to attempt to not overcomplicate this to the point where we have to break down like other people. Does that make sense? So as far as like, say something about a mechanical term, and then obviously I don't do it, so I don't want to talk too much about that thing. I'm literally going to try to focus on exactly what I'm trying to do and then what I'm doing. Now, I'll talk about things that I do pretty well and things that I want to focus more on achieving from my delivery. So just probably like 4 weeks before I left for Puerto Rico, I actually recorded a podcast on where I wanted to take my delivery and how I wanted to adjust it. I wanted to gain some deception. I wanted to do something from the physical standpoint that could potentially throw hitters off. I wanted to get back to the simple understanding for myself with move fast, throw fast, right? Now, I've talked about in the past about how I look at delivery or the mechanics from multiple people, in terms of how your body type best represents the way that you should throw. Accelerators and drivers, that's on my website. Just go check that out, so I won't have to explain that. But for me, I kind of fit maybe in a little bit of both based on my body type. I'm long, lanky. I don't have a ton of mass, but I do have mass to produce into the ground. So for me, the initial move is something that I take extremely serious. I think it sets me up for the entire delivery. Now, it sucks because this video that I'm breaking down doesn't actually have my initial move. It actually has like my foot kind of halfway off the ground. But all I'm trying to do in that initial move is tempo. Like, my initial move is initiating the tempo of my delivery. Now, I think for the most of us, we think about explosiveness and we try to be explosive, but we try to initiate our explosiveness later in our delivery. And I just think from a simplicity standpoint, as far as like setting ourselves up for success in our delivery, whatever you give the body initially, like whatever input that you give the body, you try to tell the body to do, I think it just takes that and runs with it, rather than like having a different input in the beginning and then trying to change tempo. Now, I've talked about this in the past as well. As I lift my leg here, I'm thinking like, how quickly can I take my foot off the ground? And that's really it. I used to be like in the mindset of, all right, how quickly can I take my foot off the ground and how quickly can I put it back down? But I've realized, again, this is personal kind of cue here. I've realized over time that all I really have to do is think about taking my foot off the ground quick, because then the body's going to adapt to that stimuli, and then it's just going to basically put it down. Now, it's not that I'm sitting here trying to initiate a super high leg lift, even though I know everyone kind of talks about that, how I get so high. It's just about the quickness of that. The initiating that quick leg lift gets my leg that high. Now, from the actual, this is the way I look at kind of the physics standpoint. I'm not a physics major or anything, but this is kind of the way that I look at it, is like, all right, now that I've initiated a super quick kind of leg lift here, and now I'm getting a lot of height, I'm also going to now be able to produce more force and more acceleration down, right? So the higher that it goes, the more space it has to travel, which I think can pick up the acceleration through that space. I missed a step though. I wanted to talk about my back foot positioning. Okay, so now anyone that's going to initiate, in my opinion, a high leg lift like that, especially at the tempo that I'm initiating this at, the back foot is going to want to turn. It's going to want to turn as you lift your leg high. It's just a kind of a movement restriction or a movement compensation. Now, I've done a breakdown on that with Walker Buehler. I've talked about the preset quarter turn and do I think it's beneficial and so on and so forth. Not really going to dive into that, but I do want to talk about the actual turn as you initiate that leg lift. I try to avoid that. I try to avoid any kind of compensation with that drive foot, because I think that's, you sacrifice drive leg stability when that foot kind of turns, right? There's that compensation, and I think there's some sacrifice there of the overall stability of the drive leg. And I've talked about why I believe stability is one of the biggest, crucialist, if that's a word, pieces of the delivery. So I go ahead, before I even lift my leg, I preset that foot and I preset it turned. Now we can get into the discussion of direction and whoa, what about your direction? I'm giving my body direction, right? Like, direction is based, my opinion, is based on where you determine direction is. It's not always set like, okay, if my shoulders are facing home plate, now that's straight. Like, I believe that I can kind of give my body the direction that it needs to accomplish whatever task it is, whether it be like those guys that are cross-fired, right? Like, their body understands direction differently than the guys that maybe are the Bartolo Colognes who open their front foot, right? Just because they're not going quote unquote forward doesn't mean their direction is being sacrificed. Now, I won't even dive into the concept of like crossfire and open, like how that can affect things, but just from the back foot positioning, that's something that I do. Is I before I even start my leg lift, I quarter turn that back foot. So when I lift my leg and I take all of that tempo up into my peak leg lift, my body is not going into any shift. It's not compensating. It's just sturdy. I want to be sturdy and I want to be stable as I lift my leg. Now, looking at peak leg lift, obviously with the amount of space that I've covered, now as I go down, there's going to be more force potential to put into the ground. There's going to be more forward acceleration to add. There's this huge concept that I'm really passionate about right now, and it's falling. Everyone looks at falling in the delivery and demonizes it and say, oh, I don't want to fall, I want to drive. Well, like, perception, right? Like, it's all different. But I know with falling can be a great benefit to someone in their delivery if they can control the fall. And by control, I just mean like, stability. Basically, it always comes down to like stability of that drive leg. But falling with gravity is actually an extremely beneficial move due to the slope, right? We're the only overhead athletes to throw on a slope. We want to utilize the slope. The slope is giving us an ability to accelerate in our fall faster, right? So when I look at my delivery, I'm like, okay, peak leg lift. Now I can fall. I have more space to cover with that front foot. So not only do I have a ton of tempo with that leg lift, but now I also have a ton of space to cover from peak leg lift where my foot is to where now it's going to land, right? And now my job in this, the body's job, is as I descend, I need to make sure that drive leg is able to absorb that force as I come down from this leg lift. Because if it doesn't, now I have a very unauthentic type of fall. Very, very mediocre, unstable. I'm not able to absorb kinetic energy in that drive leg, right? Again, I don't want to get too over complex, but now as I descend from this, if I don't stabilize here in this drive leg, then I can't absorb energy. I can't hold energy in that drive leg for when it's time to then internally rotate and have the arm come up. So all that energy that I've absorbed in that drive leg can come up. Now I actually do leak a little bit. Again, I know this gets tough if you're just listening to the audio, but on the visual, you can see that as I descend, I hold that position of that drive leg pretty well, but as you can see that knee starts to leak, and there's not really a huge point in which I hold that. Now that's something that a lot of people have talked to me about in terms of like the pelvis starts to leak early, or the rear hip starts to internally rotate early. I actually believe that the hip rotation should be initiated kind of right after you stabilize all that energy. So as I mentioned, peak leg lift, the initiation of that foot tempo, I believe, talked about this in the past, I believe that lead foot tempo, the hands got to match that tempo or at least come really close to it. So if you initiate a lot of lead foot tempo, if that tempo is really increased and the speed of it's increased, now I believe that the speed of your your extension, your stride length, the tempo of your hand now is going to match that lead foot tempo. Now, this is a huge piece that I take pride in, is not trying to defy gravity as I come down from leg lift. That's going to be a huge piece that the brain's going to monitor as a potential threat as I descend from this leg lift. It's going to say, wait, we don't have that stability of that drive leg, or we don't have overall trunk stability, so then it's going to want to shoot back. I've kind of done a really good job here as I descend from my leg lift to stay center mass, right? To keep my head. Now there's going to be a little tilt because I'm trying to essentially load this hip, but there's not going to be an over exaggerated tilt where I try to defy gravity, which takes away from the overall acceleration down the slope into front foot strike, right? So hopefully you got that. As soon as I come down from my leg lift, my trunk doesn't shoot all the way back. I have a little bit of tilt to load the hip a little bit, but I'm not trying to defy that forward gravity, right? I think there's a huge difference in loading up the drive leg, loading up the rear hip, and defying gravity. Okay, so I did a breakdown on Rowland Chapman literally yesterday. I'll try to get that video up as quick as possible, but you'll see how he accomplishes forward momentum in his initial move and a loading of the hip pattern as he's going forward. Now that's a move that I try to get better at, but it's a difficult move. Just basically, if you can picture it, the ability to hip hinge and load that rear glute while accelerating forward, okay? So now along with that, I obviously have a shorter hand path. My arm action's been simplified over the years. That's a huge piece to why I believe I can accelerate simply. If you have a ton of acceleration, but your arm is trying to get to multiple checkpoints, or your hand is getting to multiple checkpoints, you're going to have a more difficult time to get into repeatable slot, and you're going to have a more difficult time to accelerate your body forward, because your brain's going to basically tell your body, whoa, dude, like our arm has no chance. Our hand has no chance to get into that slot that it needs to get into, so it's going to automatically shoot you backwards and try to give yourself time. Kind of gives me off on a tangent in regards to time and how I think the worst cue to use as an instructor is get on time, right? Stay back, all of these things. I believe that you can actually accelerate your hand and arm faster by the way of your acceleration of the body. So I have like 5 minutes left because, like I said, the bus is leaving. I probably should redo this podcast, but and then in regards to the kind of the ending piece to my delivery is I'm trying to rotate into front foot strike. I've done a ton of stuff on that. Just basically keep my pelvis locked in as long as I can, and then get my rear hip to start to internally rotate, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, pretty early throughout the process to create authentic separation and segmentation. Now, I do a really good job of keeping my shoulders neutral, keeping my trunk neutral, while having the ability to take that rear hip into internal rotation, as you can see with that back foot positioning. If you were to look at that back foot position, you'll be able to see that. So the segmentation for me is a huge piece. I get most of my power output by launching from stretch, which I've talked about. You can see that on my YouTube, is basically as you anchor down, you're still in a position of stretch, and you launch from that stretched position rather than seconds before, or frames before anchoring down, your trunk starts to rotate to pull your arm through, and then you're not launching from stretch. You create stretch initially by the way of early internal rotation, but then it starts to go, your trunk starts to pull, and you're not anchored down yet. So as you can see, I'm at anchor point in this visual here, and that back foot tells me that my rear hip's into about 45 degrees of internal rotation, and my trunk's neutral. It's it's not counter rotate, it's not really closed, but it's neutral. My hand's in a good spot. It's on time. It's going to allow that hand positioning for me is going to allow now my trunk rotation and trunk flexion to initiate a higher speed of the arm. It's going to take the arm into more acceleration because my trunk now is going to be pulling it through with bigger muscles rather than the arm having to independently generate power. And then another piece that I'm looking at when I anchor down is where's my transfer of energy, right? Where's my weight distribution? I want this transfer. I want all of that drive leg energy we talked about earlier to be transferred, so there's no energy in that drive leg as soon as I anchor down. It's all transferred to the front. You can see by the way of someone anchoring down at a front foot strike where they're at as far as their head positioning. I like guys to be, at least 55, 45, 60, 40 is great. You just want to be able to absorb a lot of force into that lead leg to transfer it up. Basically, the force from the backside transferring to the lead side is a huge piece. And then now, as you come in, as I start to rotate, now my job is to just block, just to brace this, right? So I don't want any knee valgus. I don't want the knee to shift forward. You can see that knee starts to then go into extension. We've talked a lot about lead leg block and how there's a misconception in regards to like hyperextension of the knee. I don't believe in really a whole lot of knee extension. Just make sure that when you do land, that your knee's not going forward, it's absorbing that force. And now the pelvis rotates over the fixed femur, and you can see there's a little bit of knee extension. But you can also see, this is something I've worked hard on too, before I got out here to Winterball, was getting my trunk rotation and trunk flexion to then pull my arm through into higher rates of acceleration. I believe, if you watch like a guy like Tyler Glass now, how he gets into trunk flexion like this in this visual here, which I believe the rotation and flexion of the trunk can pull the arm through into higher rates of acceleration. You get more shoulder extension, late launch over the lead knee, and that can help in the deception as well. So then I finish, and I just want an arm deceleration pattern that matches plane to shoulder rotation and gives my arm more time to decelerate, and then leg swing. All right, so talking more about the finish, as I talked about the trunk flexion, trunk rotation, I'm a big advocate for like the arm acceleration, and how sometimes you see like a lot of guys, they try to independently generate acceleration with their arm by way of the inability to like segment, right? So just a quick recap on that is looking at the back side of my delivery. If you looked at drawing a circle on the rear hip and the throwing shoulder, right? This is like the segmentation conversation. So if we looked at those two moving parts, I want as much segmentation from those as possible coming down to my anchor point, right? Because there's a fine line of like holding the pelvis, keeping the pelvis neutral, keeping the trunk neutral, staying closed. You hear that terminology often. So for me, there's the fine line of like, all right, yes, I'm trying to stay closed, trying to delay, even though I don't like that terminology all that much. But as soon as it comes time for those hips to go, and that's going to vary per individual, but as soon as it comes time to go, they're going now. So you can see the direction of my back knee actually kind of helps me in the ability to start my hip rotation. But as soon as those hips internally rotate and that back knee collapse, I'm almost thinking, not thinking about this in a game, obviously, but like in my prep work and my mechanical progressions, I'm thinking about as soon as my hip starts to internally rotate, to try to give you a picture of this, I'm thinking about taking now my elbow back and initiate my scap retraction. So you have like one side, the lower half going one way in one direction and the upper half going the other direction. Now looking at this on screen, like this is a really good visual from the back, straight behind like center field view, is you can't really see the rear shoulder like go back in terms of counter rotating. I'll use the word counter rotate a lot, even though I don't think it happens, but it's a good cue to think about. But you can see that elbow is going to initiate the retraction, while this back knee direction is actually going to take this hip internal rotation into its rotation. Just a fair warning, I did just kind of wake up as I'm finishing this podcast, so I'm going to try to get a lot done today. All right, so you can see it there, how the elbow kind of goes back and as the knee collapses and the hips rotate. So now what you have is, as I anchor down there, that's a really good picture of essentially how I'm generating velocity. Now, I do want to say I was kind of like reviewing the other audio that I was doing the other day on this, and by no means do I think I'm perfect. I think there's a lot of flaws that I have in my delivery, and me being a perfectionist want to clean all of that up. But in terms of something that I do exceptionally well is my ability to create a really good amount of segmentation and separation. So you hear the word like hip shoulder separation a lot. This is, for me is I think a huge indication of my throwing velocity. So you can see that front foot is anchored down. The back foot gives us a good indication of where that rear hip is in space. So that's rotated. Have a good ability, good T-spine mobility. So now after anchor point, this is where the arm's acceleration occurs by way of the trunk completing its rotation, or the hips completing their rotation, which pulls the trunk through into a higher rate of acceleration and then pulls the arm through. For me, there's something that just while we're on this subject, I think I can do a better job of, and this might be a structural thing. Ever since I had bone spurs in 2016, I've lacked a lot of elbow extension, elbow flexion. So but when I anchor down right here, I would like for my hand, to be more so inside that 90-degree threshold, right? So you can see it there. It's right at 90, but in my opinion, if you can get that inside, you can now pull the hand through into a deeper state of layback, right? Because if you looked at, and this is something that, sorry, move my chair. This is something that I look at a lot for myself when I'm like in the lab study and stuff. Is I'll look at like my pull down videos and my long toss videos, and my hand actually does get inside that 90-degree threshold, which does get me into a deeper state of layback. And I'll try to find a way to include those pictures that I did on the web page when I end up creating this. I guess I should include the notion that the link to the web page that I create for this whole thing, that will include obviously the audio, but also the video and the pictures that I mentioned just now about my long toss comparison to my mound and my deeper state of external rotation or layback. So like I said, if there was one thing that I wish would be a little bit cleaner here is my hand getting inside 90. I think there's more external rotate or more layback to be had there. But I really like how my trunk pulls the arm through, and then as I continue to go get my glove almost, right? It kind of looks like that, even though it's not my glove pulling. I'm going to get it instead of like pulling my glove into my trunk and keeping my trunk stagnant. You can see right here in this visual that my glove stays kind of in this area. It doesn't come back to meet my trunk. My trunk actually goes out to get glove side. So you see it, go get it. So now I have trunk flexion, trunk extension, trunk flexion, trunk rotation. And then ideally, I know this visual can't see it. I tried to chop these videos up as best as I could. But ideally, at ball release, I would like a straight line, right? I would like a straight line all the way to my toe and maximizing hip extension. But that's pretty good right there. I think there's a lot of factors that can kind of skew that trail leg. But there's something there. And then the arm decel. Arm decel sometimes could be an issue for me because I do have such an over the top slot that I have to match this acceleration of the slot, which could sometimes lead into getting real tight with that left hip, and sometimes I'll want to compensate, but right there is pretty good. I've never actually had a good deceleration pattern. That's going to be a project for me moving forward. So focus on decel, but you can see like I don't have a lot of great decel room. There is probably my end. I think what I want to do moving forward in my development when I get back to the lab is I want to find a mechanism to give myself more time, because I do believe the arm can only accelerate as fast as it can decelerate. So if there's a way that I can kind of manipulate this into almost taking my trunk rotation all the way through and like having a Clayton Kershaw-esque spinning off instead of just a leg swing going forward, it can maybe give my arm more time. Almost like I said, manipulate that in a way. So hopefully that makes sense. But yeah, that's gonna be the finish. And everyone asked me about this leg swing, but for me, the leg swing is just kind of like a byproduct of just fully transferring all of that energy to the front. and just kind of sticking the landing, so to speak. And then that's just a byproduct. The leg just kind of comes up and swings over. So to be honest, I didn't start doing it because it looks cool. Like, I started doing it because I wanted a lot of freedom. And when you watch like Latin guys, like Latin American guys that throw fuel, they kind of all have that similar, that thing in common, right? And I think when I just started throwing with freedom and trying to be loose, that was just something that kind of happened. So don't hate it, whatever. Don't think it's a huge indication of velocity, but maybe it could help be an indicator of, like, are we transferring as much energy that we're storing up in that drive leg as possible, right? So now I'm going to get out of this video, then I'm going to go back to the other video. Okay, so I actually found, I forgot I had these as a screen record of one of my first outings. But open side and back side, it's going to be a little bit better because I didn't edit these in terms of slow-mo. But first thing is going to be the setup, how I set myself up. Remember, I don't know if I actually touched on this, but it was something I did want to touch on, was like, I know you can't see it from the side, but I'm actually putting a lot of emphasis on like my setup. Okay, so I'm actually presetting this kind of position. I've talked about this when I was back in the lab in California. It was like, I'm setting myself up to almost think about this rear hip being pushed back to preset kind of that feeling of glute engagement, right? And as I kind of take this and push it back here, I now feel like I'm a lot more sturdy and stable in that drive leg. The next thing that I mentioned, I remember this particular outing, so this will be a kind of a good visual. But remember how I talked about that foot positioning? I want to preset kind of just a little bit quarter turn with that foot. So when I lift, there's not a whole lot of movement. There's not a whole lot of compensation. So as I mentioned, this is a good visual because I didn't do it this particular outing because there's a hole on the rubber. And if I were to preset my foot, then half my foot would be in the hole, half would be out. And then we talk about instabilities, like it's a pretty easy thing to be unstable, right? If you're half in a hole, half not. So I didn't do this particular outing, so it's a good visual as far as like what happens when I lift, right? So you'll see initiate that leg lift. Again, I'm thinking tempo, 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 quickly initiate leg lift with that lead foot. And now you'll see that turn, right? So right there is that's the turn that I'm talking about. So you'll see that my knee goes up and then that foot starts to cave and it actually starts to turn, right? So right there in that positioning, let's see if I can get in this one too, right there. Okay, so it's starting ankle evert. That's actually the position that I would preset my foot, right? If I'm gonna get there already, I want to get there with as less movement as possible because this is, again, kind of one of those personal experience kind of observation, just one of those things that I've just observed. I think that the less movement that we have in our initial move, especially with the one thing that's connected to the ground that's providing us with stability, the less movement, the more that we can be stable, right? And I believe that the more movement, maybe potentially the less stable that we are, more compensation. So again, setting myself up for success for what I'm trying to do in the delivery is a huge piece for me. And I believe, again, it starts with the set position. For me, the foot positioning. I would always encourage guys, like, have an understanding. Again, like if you're 12 years old, it's not a huge importance. But if you're an elite guy, you know, that has dreams playing at the highest level, man, like have an idea of what you're trying to do and have a reason why you're doing, you know, things in your delivery. So good. And again, as I mentioned, I'm really trying to put a lot of emphasis on just the tempo, man, initiating extremely high amounts of acceleration with my initial move, right? The initial move is like the most important piece, in my opinion. And if you set yourself up for success with what you're trying to do in your delivery with a good initial move, then you're doing a lot of things right. So again, I'm trying to incorporate a lot of good tempo in the initial move, and I'm also trying, as I draw these lines, I'm also trying to get going, okay? I'm trying to get going down the mound. As you see that before I reach peak leg lift, I'm already starting to move and shift my weight down the slope, right? If you get one thing out of this entire audio or visual that you're watching, it's to understand that I'm trying to use the slope, okay? I'm trying to use the slope to my advantage. The slope is going to be there to provide us with higher rates of acceleration. There's a lot of things that we can do to defy what the slope is going to give us, defy the gravity. And for me, I'm just trying to accept it and use it to my advantage, right? So pick the leg up. Now, as I get to the peak of my leg lift, I'm going to have more space to cover, which could be more force to provide into the ground and more rates of acceleration. Now, as I get into the midline, you can see that I'm a little bit over my backside. This is a good visual of it right here. So I'm loading up my glute. I'm loading up that rear hip, but I'm not to the point where I'm shooting so far back that I'm defying my forward gravity. I'm defying forward acceleration, right? So I'm gonna load up the glute. I'm gonna store energy in there, and this is a really good visual too of that foot positioning, right? So if the rubber's there, foot's there. Okay, so that just gives me a little bit more opportunity to be stable. Now, putting emphasis on the front foot, trying to close the front foot, close the front side, ride down the mound. My hand path, in my opinion, my arm action allows me to pick up my rate of acceleration, right? Knowing that I don't have a whole lot of checkpoints to get to with my hand. It's pretty simple. I'm trying to maintain elbow flexion. And now again, as I come down into my anchor point, that was the whole thing we kind of just previously discussed with the segmentation, taking my shoulder or taking my elbow into my retraction while my hip goes. Again, this is something that in game I'm not thinking about, right? I'm not conscious of all of these moving parts, but if I do them enough in my lab work, my mechanical work, all of these things in my progressions, like I can create motion memory, create motor patterns, and I'm kind of speaking as if these are things that I'm conscious of in those settings, right? Not so much on the mount. So that's a huge piece, is like, don't think I'm thinking all this in game, right? I don't want you guys listening to this have 900 thoughts going through your mind in a game. That's not the goal. Okay. So now hip rotation, segmentation keeps the trunk neutral. Boom. You can see now as I land there that I have my weight shifted into my lead leg. Knee is in flexion. And now as I land and transfer my energy, I'm going to rotate the pelvis over the fixed femur, which is going to go then now shoot the knee into a little bit of extension. That's something that I think I can do a little bit better job of in terms of my lead leg block. That's going to be another project for me as I get home, so I'll speak probably more on that in the next upcoming months. And now you can see that the trunk again going to get that glove. And then all the things we just touched on with the deceleration. Okay? So what am I trying to accomplish in my mechanics? I'm trying to accomplish the simple notion of utilizing the slope, utilizing gravity, utilizing athleticism. For me, I put a huge amount of emphasis on my overall athleticism, overall freedom. I talk about that all the time. I feel like that you can't do a lot of the things that you want to do from an athletic standpoint, from a explosiveness standpoint, if you're not loose, right? If you're kind of tense, which is a very common thing to be, especially in a game environment, then it's going to be a lot harder for you to achieve these explosive type movements. So boom, comes set, breath, diaphragm, nose, mouth, okay, comes set, and then boom, initiate leg lift, tempo, and let's freaking go. Let's ride, sink, let's, yeah, boom, boom, right?